Welcome to The Future We Need and How to Get It. This is the 6th in our 7-show series, and tonight we're taking on how to change the game, shaping the systems that shape us. And I have in the studio a guest, Eve Majure, who is the Northern California director of the Reversing Runaway Inequality movement. And I want to talk just a little bit with you all about why I have invited Eve and why I'm so excited about this work based on this book by Les Leopold, Runaway Inequality. As you know, in order to change a system, you really have to know something about how the system works. And the more complex the system, the more we need to understand it. And what is driving poverty and inequality and injustice, and increasingly the power of the oligarchy in this country, are a number of moves that actually got laid out strategically back in the 70s, I think it was, right? Yeah. And they attacked from a number of different fronts. And a whole lot of things have been going on in the way of very severe misdoing and the need to reclaim regulations, changes in law, and changes in our social norms that will reverse the inequality. And Les has done a very thorough analysis of what is involved in that, and is helping the public understand what that is. And in this effort to change systems, I'm coming at it in two different ways. Part of it is more conceptual, and I'd like to remind all of you that there is an 18-month course for free from MIT that meets in real time once a month on Thursday mornings, Pacific time, Thursday mornings from 7 to 8:30, the second Thursday of the month. And it meets a second time in real time on the fourth Thursday. The first time is speakers. The second meeting is just conversations with people from all over the world, change agents from all over the world, some 1,200 or more who have signed up for this course. And they're really looking at what, just like this program has been doing, what are the changes already occurring in the world that are beginning to produce a new conception of what a healthy economy and a healthy democracy would look like. So that's the conceptual side of it. Meanwhile, what is exciting, some of our own homegrown changes that are going on, is this campaign on reversing runaway inequality and the poor people's campaign that is also shaping up that have much in common. So I'm delighted to have Eve here tonight because you're doing these trainings, helping people understand this, and then to help build a real movement out of it, having identified what changes are needed. How do we make those happen? So welcome.
Thank you, Nancy. It's great to be here. And like you said, we are nationwide providing as an educational campaign a one-day workshop and shorter presentations on reversing runaway inequality based on the book by Les Leopold, An Activist Guide to Economic Justice. And it truly is an activist guide because the whole idea is that we be able to build a mass movement that is going to bring issue groups together. We call it, let's make the silos more porous. You can stay in your silos if you're environmental or immigration or Black Lives Matter, healthcare, income inequality, poverty, voter suppression, LGBTQ. These are all important issues. And we need to work together and make our issues, silos, more porous. And that means being able to work not only in our issue silos, but to work with a larger group and be able to build a mass movement because all of the issues that we look at, so many are interconnected due to runaway inequality. Many of the issues you brought up in terms of capitalism and greed and the owners being able to have unreal levels of power due to our campaign finance system primarily over the years. And as you said, back in the early 70s, is when, after the Vietnam War, inflation was rising. They were looking for a new philosophy of business that would also reduce regulation in business. And the Powell Memo is one of those
What is that again? The Powell Memo?
Yes.
What is that?
A seminal piece, actually, written in 71 by soon to become Justice Powell on the Supreme Court. At the time, he was the education chair of the Chamber of Commerce. And he said, we're getting our clocks cleaned as business. They're coming down at us with regulations on environment. The environmental department had been set up, EPA. Auto regulations, union rights were hitting across all sectors.
Labor rights, yeah.
And so the Powell Memo defined in 21 pages what the Chamber of Commerce needed to do about it, and that they needed to have a coordinated campaign, get out of their issue silos, get out of their industry silos, and get together from soap to steel.
That's soap to steel. Across all industries, a massive joint effort
Right.
to give the country back to business.
That's right. And including the small businesses. That was their brilliance in terms of not just representing the largest corporations, so that they have the small guy, they can make the case that we are for all business, and all of these regulations are hurting small business in particular, when that wasn't necessarily always the case. And so push for a deregulation of industries in general. The Powell Memo called for coming together, moving to the headquarters of the Chamber from New York to Washington, D.C., and to start funding not only Republicans, which they primarily funded in terms of campaign funding in the past, but to now start funding Democratic candidates and electeds as well.
You mentioned the other day when we were talking that previously the unions were funding the Democrats and the business was funding Republicans.
Right.
Now the business decides to also fund Democrat, and they got probably a lot more money than the unions to play with.
Right. And one of the graphs that we have in the book shows just how extensive the corporate funding is compared to unions and individual issue groups. I mean, it's just way outshadows.
And you mentioned they were also funding university professorites and
Part
so
of the Powell Memo was not only to develop think tanks, to bring up pundits that could go on the media and be super articulate, and they had to be correct, the memo said. They could not make mistakes. They could not be caught in an error. They had to be credible. And also to fund university chairs and departments in the business schools. And we've recently seen the Koch brothers just got called out for doing that at George Mason University, influencing faculty hires. So there was much more than I've even able to tell you, but the Powell Memo was when it started and ushered in a virtual intellectual takeover of both parties. Milton Friedman became the key proponent. That was neoliberalism, if you will. We call it the Better Business Climate in the book, in that it ushered in deregulation of industry, pressures on unions so that industry would not have to deal with unions as much, lowering taxes on corporations, and reducing social spending so that there was more of an incentive to work at a lower wage. And by doing this, all boats would rise, the trickle down. If we gave the industry all this, incentives and money, then all boats would rise. But of course it didn't.
It's been the opposite.
Yep. And so when you talk about pressures and levers on systems, I think it's important to look at all of those in terms of the impacts on inequality. And in effect, what our petition calls for specifically in terms of the levers, I gave you a little bit of history. So then also in the 80s, deregulation of the financial sector was a huge primary contributor to the wage flatlining that we've seen.
And he explains all these things in the
Right,
book, so you
right.
get a really good understanding.
It all began, wages started to flatline, and they basically have not
Flatlined
gained
ever, right.
anything. If you were working in 30 years old back in the 70s, and now you're 50 more years, so you're 80 years old, you'd be basically making, in the same job, you'd be basically making the same money while productivity is skyrocketed. People in the U.S. would be making twice as much had wages kept up with productivity gains as they used to. And so that deregulation of the financial industry, and we call it financialization, was a key contributor to wages flatlining.
So do you see the reversing runaway inequality, in a way, given what you've said, is kind of going back and reversing this strategy. Just kind of taking the Powell memo, turning it around and
Yes.
saying, okay, this is how we take back our country point by point by
Right.
point.
Yes, I really like that concept of systems and the levers and pressures and looking at all of those. So it's about forming things like public banks. Our petition includes public banks, which includes postal banking for the retail sector to get rid of payday lending practices and provide a low-cost alternative for people in the 30,000 branches of the post office nationwide. They're the best. They're in the urban areas. They're in the rural areas where the banks aren't.
They're everywhere.
Yep. And public banks, of course, such as the Bank of North Dakota, and Bank of California, would be a reservoir and a depository for all of our state tax revenues, and the state would decide how to invest
we
that.
would have, and I know there is a movement, and a lot of people here in Santa Cruz working on that, we would create a state bank of
Right.
California.
Right.
And we would, in a sense, keep, instead of our money going to the commercial banks, it would stay here
Right.
and we could use it to build our own roads, provide student loans that are reasonable.
Main Street loans.
Main Street loans, housing,
Agriculture.
agriculture,
Solar.
all at a much more reasonable rates. And whatever money is made from that would come back into the people's
That's
coffers.
right. Instead of the state paying out millions in fees and interest to the banks, they would be gaining money.
The one I heard one time, it really struck me. They said, we collect in California billions, trillions of dollars in state taxes, revenues, etc. When then we take all that money, it doesn't just sit there. We put it in commercial banks.
Right.
And then when we need to spend $1 billion to build a bridge,
We have to borrow.
we have to turn around and borrow it, and then it costs us $2 billion.
Right.
While $1 billion goes in interest to the banks that are actually using our money.
That's right.
And that would change all that.
Yes. One of the examples Les makes is that the city of Los Angeles spent more in paying fees for loans and other fees to Wall Street in a year than it did on its whole road system. That's the city of Los Angeles. Than it did on its entire road infrastructure. So yeah, public banks there's three pillars to the public banking idea. There's the California or state bank. You'd have your municipal or city banks, such as Oakland and San Francisco are trying to do.
If they're big enough.
If they're big enough and they can get the charter. And the third would be postal banking, which gets
Got it.
at the retail level. So public
Got it.
banks is one of our...
And just one other thing I've heard before, peculiar to California and a few other states, is the amount of marijuana money
Yes.
that cannot be banked in regular banks anyhow in it.
Right.
And that the state of California would like to get the taxes
Yes.
from all those sales.
That's right.
Got it.
And I read an article in the American Banker the other day. Samoa became only the second.
That's right. They just became a state
Just
bank.
last week, after 2 years of working, they got their charter, and now Samoa. They haven't made a commercial loan. They said in Samoa for like 5 years, and now they'll be able to do some Main Street loans, etc. And so the
government-
American Banker is quite upset about this and said other U.S. states are watching. You guys better let's
And
watch
the
Samoa.
The governor of New Jersey just elected. Isn't Les Leopold working
Yes.
with him to get a state
Yeah,
bank
he
going
ran
there?
on public banking and was elected.
Got it.
Yep, Governor Murphy, I believe his name is. So Les is working to ensure that the postal banking be part of that. He's working with the postal unions. There are 4 postal unions that are all on board for postal
Cool.
banking.
Fantastic.
Second out of the 5 areas on our petition in terms of just key levers to address the severe inequality that we've seen from financial deregulation over these past many years by both parties. Deregulation of the financial sector.
Right.
Repeal of Glass-Steagall, NAFTA trade agreements, all of these things. The allowing trading in derivatives that got snuck into a commodity bill under the Clinton administration that brought on the 2008. So taxing Wall Street.
Brought on the 2008 recession.
Yes.
Severe recession came about partly because of the deregulation.
Yes.
That broke things we already knew how to do.
Right.
And we'd learned that from the Depression,
Right.
And then we turn around and are doing it again, the same
Right.
bad
Repealing
mistakes.
Glass-Steagall is a perfect example of that. It separates the investment versus the retail side of banking. So Glass-Steagall was repealed under Clinton. So much was under Clinton. So the second area that we really want to look at is, in terms of recommendations, is a tax on Wall Street of, I believe it's 0.0, a small sales tax, a small fraction of 1% on every trade of Wall Street. Yes. And, 84% of all stock is owned by, I think the 1% is by very top percent of the economy. And so there would be no harm on these trades, just a small fraction of 1% on trade on stocks, bonds, and derivatives trades. Everyone would have a small percent. That would alone would raise enough money to fund tuition-free colleges. Nationwide.
Tuition-free colleges?
Yes, nationwide.
Could be funded
by just that alone.
From that alone.
Yeah.
Whoa. Okay, where do I sign up?
Okay.
And what do I do after I sign up?
And as I go through these, our goal is to have this platform be accepted by candidates and electeds so that they will say, yes, I sign up for this platform. I'm about reversing runaway inequality.
So for example, we've got our city and county elections coming up. Should we be raising these kinds of issues
Yes.
with them?
Yes, you can get the petition online at runawayinequality.org and sign it, print it out. And so it's really, really great. The third area on our petition is to end stock manipulation, which is this process of stock buybacks that you've maybe heard about recently, where the companies can buy back shares of their stock. And this was illegal and made legal. And it was illegal after the Depression in the 30s, and they legalized stock buybacks again in 1982.
And what was the result of that? What happened then?
Well, the company started using their profits, which before they could not do as much. It was, I think there was only 2% of profits at the time, and 82 was spent on stock buybacks, and now it's up to 56% of all corporate profits is spent on buying back shares of stock, retiring them so that you can grow the stock price. And it was called stock manipulation. That's why it was outlawed back in the day. So now we have inflated stock prices.
And I believe I recall Les saying something like 95% of the top CEOs or the top executives, their compensation is made up of stock options. So if they manipulate the stock, that puts money in their pocket, never
right.
mind what it does to the company
Right.
or the wages of their workers or anything else.
That's right. So and companies go into debt to buy back the stock, and so there's a lot going on with that. So that's something we would like to see repealed. It was repealed, the protection was repealed in 1982, and it should be reinstated. A wealth tax of 1% on those whose net worth is over $10 million. Sweden, Norway, Switzerland, France, Spain, all have found this an excellent way to not just have an income tax, but a wealth tax.
So does that mean, let's say someone's assets are worth $10 million.
Right.
Each year, 1% of that 10 million would be paid as a tax.
Right.
On top of whatever their income
Right.
was for that year.
They have found the very rich ways to protect their income and, store it offshore and not be taxed on it. So.
Got it.
And then repeal of the hedge fund tax loophole, which is a very complicated set of words, but it's also called the carried interest loophole. And what it does is it allows, how they got this law passed, I don't know, allows private equity managers to pretend that their income, I'm a private equity manager, I'm making some investments for you, I get fees for that. I get to pretend that that is capital gains, which is taxed at a lower rate than is income. So while capital gains might be taxed at 25%, my income might normally be taxed at 30, 40, or 50%. Well, if I'm one of these guys, I don't have to pay that high tax rate.
You know what this is bringing up? My one concern about all this, again and again, when we do this kind of analysis of a system and we're looking at these very complicated systems and people with enough money to pay experts to go in and say, okay, I want you to go in and change this little bit of the law, and now it's going to work in my favor and screw everybody else.
Yep.
And I can buy the services of someone who understands the law well enough to do that. But for the rest of us, when we're trying to create a citizens movement and the issues are this subtle, this technical, how the heck do we do it? How do we make a poster out of it? How do we explain people? How do we get them out on the street? We had a question in the audience?
Yes. It's actually a comment. I'm picking up on Eve's remarks about, I don't know how they passed this, and I'm going to suggest how it's passed. Prior to the Powell memo approach, the idea of making a contribution to a campaign was that you donated money to your candidate so they would win over the other candidate. That's the old-fashioned. In that sense, campaign contribution is part of free speech. But under Powell memo, corporate campaign donations and even non-corporate from the billionaires, it doesn't matter which wins. You donate to both sides so that both
So you
sides
own either one.
are dependent upon you, and they cannot be a serious candidate unless they do your bidding.
Right.
So they no longer invested in whether it was a Democrat or a Republican.
That's right.
They just want to make sure that they were totally dependent and they would do the corporate bidding. So it's no longer, the contributions no longer have a free speech function, they rather have a control of government function.
That's a real good point. Absolutely. So you were saying, with all of this, how do we really, create a poster or get a concept? And I go back to the causal loop diagram.
Uh-huh.
As I was thinking about coming over today, all the different incentives and pressures that have to be addressed. So while you can address the electeds and the candidates as one strategy, you've also got to be changing minds and hearts through social media, writing articles, writing letters to the editor. It seems to be we're writing letters to the Postmaster General right now as the result of the workshop we did yesterday to support postal banking. So it's not only influencing candidates and electeds, which often are bought out, and so you really have to watch that and know.
But it's really promoting specific
Issues, educate, organize, and mobilize. So I think of it as education at the local level with workshops, organizing at the state and national level and communicating and educating.
Picking up on the educating part,
Yep.
what are you trying to make happen here in the Central Coast, just around the education part? What, if people want to help make this happen, what would they do?
So we are offering half-day and full-day workshops. It's typically a full-day workshop where we cover many of the issues in the book. It's also in Spanish. We have the workshop materials and fully translated for the workbook as well. Desigualdad sin límites is the book in Spanish, and we are looking to provide workshops to groups. Just did one yesterday. We had really great
I was in it.
turnout.
Yeah,
Leaders from the
excellent.
community, activist organizations were there. We want them to take this back and for them to become trainers themselves.
So you're training trainers.
Right.
And then the trainers can go back to their communities.
Right.
And spread this word.
And thanks for asking. We have about 500 nationwide now, about half of which
Who
are
trainers. 500 trainers.
Yep. Half of them are part of our Union and Sierra Club network. One of the intersectionalities we have is we do workshops with the steel workers who work in the refineries and Sierra Club. Both are national partners of ours, and along with the Communication Workers of America, National Nurses United, Sierra Club, and the steel workers have all purchased thousands of copies of the book and are training trainers.
Thousands of copies.
Yes.
Training trainers.
And this
in
is
their
the only
fields.
source of our funding. We don't do any fundraising, only through the book sales. We are just an educational campaign. We are nonpartisan or transpartisan or whatever you want to say, because the issues hit everyone.
You wanted to talk a little bit also about the upcoming Poor People's Campaign and how that might connect with this work?
Yes, we we do see a strong connection with the Poor People's Campaign that Reverend Dr. Barber has started. It's a multi-year campaign. This as one of your videos said, it's not about who's the leader, who's the CEO, but will the system change if you switch the leader? No, he's running a multi-year campaign because these things have happened between Democrats and Republicans. And it's called Fusion Politics, bringing together the issues of immigration, voters' rights and stopping voter suppression, inequality and poverty issues, and environmental justice, because so many of people are affected that live near these.
And it's starting
They have
up.
asthma who are affected by.
It's starting up this year, picking up on the 50th anniversary of Martin Luther King's
Thank you. Yes.
march, and also what occurred at that time that we think got King killed
Right.
is that he suddenly broadened it from race relations to the whole
Class.
issue of class and poor people, and how the militarism and the environmental issues and this kind of manipulation of money
Yes.
are all interconnected. And so now we're making an interconnected, ongoing, persistent political campaign, bringing together everybody in the country who's being hurt by this stuff to actually work together.
Yes. So that's right. And so that's what's really exciting. With the underpinning of building a moral future.
Yeah.
When we talk
That's
about
his
childhood
theme,
poverty, this is one of the most compelling issues to me in this country. That we lead, except for Romania, we lead the developed nations in childhood poverty by a lot.
And I remember the moment yesterday in the workshop, I'm going to do it again. Half your audience was crying.
I know.
mean, it was so painful to actually look in the mirror and see it, and at the same time, see the way out.
Yes. And as so many people have said, and I understand, me too. Work, work, work. You keep your head down, do your job, and you're busy earning a living. And you don't have time to follow all these things that are going on behind the scenes, even more so now with Trump. There's so much media distraction that there's a lot that's going on behind the scenes. So you have to keep up with both the conceptual issues and activity on the ground.
Eve, thank you so much, because it is exactly the work you're doing that's bringing our attention back to what can make the difference. Thank you so much.
Thank you.